The foreclosure notice had been nailed to the front door sometime in the night. Ethan Cole found it at 5 in the morning, the way he found most hard things in his life, alone in the cold with no one standing beside him. The paper was damp from the overnight frost, the ink slightly blurred at the edges, but the words were perfectly clear. 9 days. He had 9 days before the bank would take everything his father had built, everything his grandfather had bled for, everything that had ever carried the Cole name in this quiet, forgotten corner of rural Montana. He stood on that porch for a long time, longer than made any sense. The wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees along the fence line, and the cattle, what few remained, stood motionless in the far pasture like bark stones against the white ground. The sky above was the color of old iron. No stars, no light coming yet, just the cold and the silence. The foreclosure notice had been nailed to the front door sometime in the night. Ethan Cole found it at 5 in the morning, the way he found most hard things in his life, alone in the cold with no one standing beside him. The paper was damp from the overnight frost, the ink slightly blurred at the edges, but the words were perfectly clear. 9 days. He had 9 days before the bank would take everything his father had built, everything his grandfather had bled for, everything that had ever carried the Cole name in this quiet, forgotten corner of rural Montana. He stood on that porch for a long time, longer than made any sense. The wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees along the fence line, and the cattle, what few remained, stood motionless in the far pasture like bark stones against the white ground. The sky above was the color of old iron. No stars, no light coming yet, just the cold and the silence and that piece of paper trembling faintly between his fingers. And in that silence, as it always did in the hardest moments, his mind went to Margaret. She had loved this porch. Even in winter, she would come out wrapped in the old wool blanket they kept by the door, holding her coffee in both hands, watching the first gray light come over the eastern hills. She used to say the ranch looked most honest before sunrise, before the day made its demands. Just land and sky and the soft breath of animals in the cold. She had been gone 11 years now, and Ethan had never moved her coffee cup from its hook by the stove. Some mornings he found himself reaching past it without thinking. Other mornings he couldn't look at it at all. He was 53 years old. His face was weathered the way good leather gets weathered, not ruined, but shaped by years of sun and wind and quiet suffering. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of a man who had fixed fences and pulled calves and buried animals and never once asked for help. His father had raised him to believe that a man who asked for help was a man who had already given up, and for most of his life, Ethan had believed that completely. But standing there that morning, with 9 days written in black ink and the cold eaten through his coat, he wasn't sure he believed anything anymore. He had tried everything the land would allow. He had sold the north pasture 2 years ago, then the equipment shed the following spring. He had taken a loan he couldn't afford and made payments he could barely cover. And then the drought came, and then the market dropped, and then his oldest breeding bull died in August without warning, and by October he was borrowing against borrowing, and the whole operation had begun to feel less like a ranch and more like a slow, quiet funeral he was attending every single morning. And Victor Hale was waiting. Victor Hale was not a villain in the loud, obvious way. He didn't shout or threaten or arrive with lawyers. He was a land developer from Billings, well-dressed, soft-spoken, with the patient eyes of a man who had learned long ago that desperation always comes to him if he simply waits long enough. He wanted the land, the water rights, and the mineral access beneath the southern ridge. He didn't want the house. He didn't want anything that had Ethan's fingerprints on it. He just wanted what was underneath, and he was perfectly content to let the bank do his work for him. Ethan went back inside, set the foreclosure notice on the kitchen table beside Margaret's old coffee cup, and sat down. The kitchen was cold and still. He made 1 cup in a pot that held 4, and he sat in the gray morning light and looked at the empty chairs around him, and he felt the full and terrible weight of a life that had slowly emptied itself out, one loss at a time. That was the night he placed the ad. He wasn't proud of it. He knew what he was doing, and he knew it wasn't entirely right, even as he typed the words. He described the ranch the way it used to be, productive, well-maintained, full of honest possibility. He mentioned a partnership, a shared life, a home with space and quiet and hard work, and something worth building together. He mentioned Christmas approaching, as if the season itself might soften whatever truth was absent from his words. He did not mention the debt. He did not mention Victor Hale. He did not mention the 9 days. He told himself it wasn't a complete lie. He told himself he just needed someone to stand beside him when the end came, someone so the silence would stop being so unbearably loud. Her name was Clara Bennett. She arrived 6 days before Christmas on a Tuesday afternoon in a truck that had clearly seen more difficult roads than this one. She was 47 years old, with dark eyes that carried no illusions and a posture that spoke quietly of someone who had long since stopped waiting for things to be easy. Her coat was practical, not warm enough for Montana in December. Her bag was one. She had driven 11 hours from eastern Wyoming, and when she stepped out of the truck and looked at the ranch, the sagging fence posts, the rust along the barn door hinges, the pasture that should have held twice as many cattle, she stood very still for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan with those steady, undeceived eyes and said simply, "This isn't what the ad described." Not as an accusation, just as a fact, quietly, the way someone speaks when they have already survived enough disappointment that one more doesn't require raised voices. Ethan held her gaze as long as he honestly could, and then looked down at the frozen ground between them. "No," he said, "it isn't." He told her everything that evening. All of it. The debt, the notice, the 9 days, Victor Hale. He set the foreclosure paper on the kitchen table between them, the way a man sets down something he has carried too long, carefully, without drama, just placing it where it could finally be seen. Clara listened without interrupting. She held her coffee cup in both hands, the same way Margaret used to, and Ethan had to look away for just a moment when he noticed. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "I'm not angry that the ranch is struggling," Clara said, at last. Her voice was low and measured. "I've struggled. I know what that looks like." She paused. "What I don't understand is why you didn't trust me enough to say so from the beginning. I came here honest. I deserved the same." There was nothing he could say to that, because every word of it was true. Clara had her own wreckage, though she offered it slowly, in pieces, over the days that followed. She had built a blacksmithing workshop in Sheridan over 20 years, a real business with a reputation that reached 3 counties. She had learned the trade at 17 from an old craftsman who cared nothing about convention and everything about skill. She had been good at it, genuinely, uncommonly good.
But 3 years ago, a failed marriage and a partner who had signed papers she hadn't known about had taken the workshop, the equipment, and most of what she had saved. She had spent the years since doing repair work wherever she could find it, living carefully, trusting almost no one, and somewhere along the way had made peace with the idea that the best chapter of her life was probably behind her. She had answered the ad not because she believed in it completely, but because she was tired of running from the silence in her own life, and the photograph of the Montana land had looked, in some way she couldn't fully explain, like a place that still had some breath left in it. That first night, after everything had been said and the fire in the kitchen stove had burned low, Clara looked at Ethan across the table and said, "I'll stay until Christmas, but no more lies, about anything. That is the only condition I have." Ethan nodded. It was the most honest offer anyone had made him in years. The first 2 days were careful and quiet. They worked alongside each other in the way that strangers do at first, politely, with respectful distance, learning each other in small, unspoken ways. Ethan showed her the land, what remained of it. Clara walked the fence lines without complaint and asked practical questions he hadn't expected. She wanted to know where the water ran beneath the south field. She asked the age of the remaining equipment and listened carefully to his answers. And on the second afternoon, she walked into the old stone workshop behind the barn and stood in the center of it, turning slowly, studying the walls and the ceiling and the layout with an expression he couldn't read. "What was this used for?" she asked. "My grandfather ran a forge here, blacksmithing. He made tools and ironwork for half the county. My father kept it going for a while after he passed." He paused. "I never learned it myself." Clara said nothing, but she stood there a moment longer than necessary, one hand resting lightly on the old stone of the forge, and something moved behind her eyes. Something quiet and complicated, like a person recognizing a place they have been looking for without knowing it. That fourth morning, 3 days before Christmas, when Ethan heard it, he woke in the deep dark before 5, as he always did, and the house was still. But from somewhere outside came a sound, sharp, rhythmic, clean, metal meeting metal with purpose and precision, ringing out into the frozen air like a bell that had decided to speak. He pulled on his coat and boots and walked out into the cold, snow creaking softly beneath his feet, and followed the sound to the workshop. He opened the door. Clara was at the forge. She had found his grandfather's tools, the tongs and cross-peen hammers, and the worn leather apron on its hook by the far wall, and she had the coals burning deep orange in the belly of the forge, and she was working a length of iron with a focus and a sureness that made him feel he was watching something both ancient and completely alive. The firelight moved across the side of her face, her jaw set with quiet determination, her arms moving with the fluid precision of someone for whom this was not effort, but language. She didn't hear him at first, and so he simply stood in the doorway with the cold at his back and the warmth of the forge reaching toward him, and he watched and felt something shift inside his chest that had been cold and motionless for a very long time. Word traveled the way it always does in places where people live close to the land and far from everything else, slowly at first, then all at once. A neighboring farmer, Dale Hennessy, came by on the 5th day with a broken cultivator blade and a face full of quiet skepticism. Clara fixed it in under an hour and handed it back sharper than it had left the factory. Dale turned it over in his hands without speaking for a long moment, and he drove away and came back 2 hours later with 3 more broken pieces and something in his expression that was better than any compliment, simple, ungrudging respect. By the 6th day, there were people waiting outside the workshop before Clara had finished her morning coffee. The ranch didn't transform overnight, but it began, slowly and unmistakably, to breathe again. The sound of the hammer,
the glow from the workshop windows in the early dark, the quiet parade of farmers and ranchers arriving with broken things and leaving with something repaired and something more. The particular dignity that comes from being helped by someone who genuinely knows what they are doing. Ethan found himself rising each morning with something he had almost forgotten the feeling of. Not quite hope, something quieter, just the sense that the day held something worth doing. Victor Hale came on the 7th day, as Ethan had known he eventually would. He came calmly as always, with his patient half-smile and his careful eyes. He stood in the yard and looked at the activity around the workshop, and then looked at Ethan and said without urgency, "I'm raising my offer. One time. Take it today, and you walk away with something real. Wait, and you walk away with nothing. Simple as that." Ethan looked at him. Then he turned and looked back at the workshop, where the hammer was still ringing out its steady, sure rhythm against the winter morning. "I'll let you know," Ethan said. That evening, after supper, Clara spread a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table and set her finger on a town 50 miles south. "There's a Christmas Eve market in Millerton," she said. "I've been working nights after the repairs, not just tools, ironwork, decorative pieces, art." She paused and looked at him directly. "If we load the truck and go, if the work is good enough, we might make enough to bring to the bank before they close for the holiday." Ethan looked at the map. He looked at her. "That's a very big if." "Everything worth doing is," she said. They left before dawn on Christmas Eve. The truck was loaded with iron work wrapped carefully in old canvas, candle holders twisted into the shapes of pine boughs, drawer pulls shaped like horseshoes and wheat sheaves, a set of fireplace tools so finely made they looked like they belonged somewhere important, and one large piece that Clara had worked on across 3 sleepless nights, a wall hanging of an eagle in full flight, every feather suggested in iron, with a patience and a precision that went far beyond function into something that could only be called love of the work. The market was full when they arrived, and the first 2 hours were the hardest kind of hard. People walked past, glanced, smiled politely, kept moving. Ethan stood beside the table with his hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the foot traffic thin toward noon, and he felt the familiar weight returning, the weight of a man who has allowed himself almost to believe and is now preparing to pay for it. Snow had begun to fall, light and quiet, drifting down through the gray Christmas Eve sky, settling on the canvas awnings and on the shoulders of the people passing by. It was the kind of snow that doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives and softens everything it touches. And then a woman stopped. She was perhaps 60, well-dressed and unhurried, and she picked up one of the pine bough candle holders and turned it slowly in her hands, studying it with the attention of someone who recognized real craft when they encountered it. She looked up at Clara. "You made this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. The woman set it down and lifted the eagle piece. She held it carefully at arm's length, and she was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "My husband flew F-16s for 22 years, she said. "I have been looking for something for his study for longer than I can tell you." She looked at Clara. "What do you want for it?" Clara told her the price. The woman didn't negotiate. She simply nodded and reached for her purse. After that, everything changed. The woman's friends came over, then strangers who had noticed the small gathering and felt the particular energy that forms around something genuinely worth stopping for. People were not buying out of sympathy or Christmas sentiment. They were buying because the work was undeniable, because it was beautiful in the specific way that honest, handmade things are beautiful, not manufactured perfection, but something truer, something that carried the hours and the intention of the person who made it. By 4 in the afternoon, the table was nearly empty.
By 5, snow still falling gently around them, Ethan was standing beside the truck working out the numbers with a stub of pencil, and when he looked up at Clara, his eyes were bright in a way they had not been in years, perhaps in more years than he could honestly account for. "It's enough," he said. His voice came out rough and low. "Clara, it's enough." She looked at him steadily. She didn't smile right away. She just held his gaze in the quiet snowfall and then nodded slowly, the way a person nods when something they risked believing in has turned out to be real after all. They reached the bank 18 minutes before it closed for the Christmas holiday. The payment was made in full. Victor Hale received a message that evening. 3 sentences, clear and final. The Cole Ranch was no longer available. Christmas morning arrived slowly, the way the best mornings do. A pale gold light moved across the snowfields in long, unhurried waves, touching the fence posts and the workshop roof and the bare cottonwood trees along the fence line. Ethan stood on the porch with his coffee, and for the first time in more years than he could name, the quiet did not feel like an absence. It felt like something beginning. He looked at the hook by the door where the old wool blanket still hung, and for just a moment he felt Margaret's presence the way you sometimes feel the presence of the people you have loved and lost. Not as grief, but as something warmer, as if she were standing just behind the cold air, watching, and was not unhappy with what she saw. Clara came out and stood beside him, her own coffee in her hands, and together they looked out over the land without needing to fill the silence with words. The forge was cold this morning. It would be warm again tomorrow. There were already 4 repair jobs promised for the week after Christmas, and a commission from the woman at the market for a complete set of ironwork pieces. The debt was smaller now, but not gone. The fences still needed tending. The cattle still needed more than the land alone could give. But it was honest, and it was real, and it was theirs. 2 people who had arrived at this place not out of hope, but out of necessity, and who had found somewhere in the cold and the work and the truth they had finally allowed to exist between them, something neither one had been expecting. Not rescue, not miracles, just someone who showed up, told the truth, and refused to let the other one quit. That is what saves us more often than we admit. Not strength alone, not luck or timing or a sudden change in fortune, just someone who sees what you have left and stays. If this story reached something inside you today, if it reminded you that honesty is always the beginning of something good, and that the right person arriving at the right moment can change everything, please take a moment right now and subscribe to Desert Heart. Every story we bring you is made with care and made for you, for the ones who know what it means to hold on through the long winters, for the ones who are still holding. Leave us a comment below and tell us, has there ever been someone in your life who showed up exactly when you needed them most? We read every single word you write to us. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who might be standing on their own porch in the cold, wondering if it's still worth fighting for. We will see you in the next story. Until then, keep your heart open and your fire burning. This story carries real and lasting value on multiple levels. It honors the dignity of skilled trades, blacksmithing, and hands-on craftsmanship, and presents that work not as something lesser, but as something capable of saving lives and legacies. It teaches that honesty, even when it costs us something in the short term, is always the stronger foundation. It shows older viewers, the audience that needs to hear this most, that second chances do not belong only to the young.
that reinvention, partnership, and courage are available at any stage of life, even after great loss. It quietly but honestly addresses the real crisis of small American family farms and ranches disappearing under debt and corporate land acquisition, a struggle that millions of American families know firsthand. It explores grief not as a wound that disables, but as a presence that can, with time, become something closer to comfort and continuity. And beneath everything else, it carries the oldest and most important truth of all, that what saves us is almost never what we expect, and almost always arrives in the form of another person willing to be honest with us and to stay.